Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson. Welcome to episode 79 of Sports Management Podcast, where I speak with not one, but two great guests. The first guest is Sandy Farquharson, the founder of the Padel School. Sandy has a background from tennis as a player and a coach, but transitioned into padel about 11 years ago. He was managing a racket facility at the time who had some padel courts, and Sandy wanted to learn more about the new sport. And he wanted to learn from the best, so he went to Spain to learn as much as he possibly could. In 2019, Sandy started the Padel School and has been educating people about padel since, both in person and through his very popular YouTube channel. The second guest is Ben Nichols, and he is the founder of padel-22, the first padel-dedicated communications consultancy. Ben is the first guest who appeared twice on Sports Management Podcast, which I am very happy about. Last time was in episode 20, where he spoke about media relations in sport and his experiences from working with WADA, Formula 1 and the ATP. Today we speak about padel, one of the fastest growing sports in the world. Both guests have experiences from Dubai and the UK, and together with my own experience from the padel in Sweden, we had a very interesting discussion of how far padel has come in a short time and what we can expect in the future. Get ready to learn. Should padel be considered a threat to other racket sports like tennis and squash? Why did Sandy start the Padel School? How is the padel landscape in the UK? Did padel in Sweden rise too fast for its own good? Why Ben started padel-22 and much more. And as always, we are sponsored by InSport Education, the online business school for sport. For 2023, they have created some amazing new courses and modules. How about the marketing of women's sport, data in sport, governance and geopolitics, and many more. As always, you get 10% off all courses, programs, and modules with the code Sports Management Podcast 10. The first module starts already in February, so sign up now before it's too late. The link is in the show notes. Now, let's hear from Ben and Sandy. Welcome to a new episode of Sports Management Podcast, and today I am here with two great guests, and it is Sandy Farquharson and Ben Nichols. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Marcus. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Marcus. Good to be here.
For those who might recognize the last voice there from Ben, he was on an early episode talking about anti-doping, and now I'm very glad to have you back. And the topic for today's episode will be padel, which you are now both working in the industry of padel.
Yes.
Yeah. So Sandy, you are both a player and you're working as a trainer and coach and some other things, and you are the founder of the Padel School. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do in padel?
Yeah, so I first started padel about 10, 11 years ago, actually in Dubai, is where I first experienced padel. And my previous background was tennis, and both playing and coaching there. And that padel journey started 10 years ago, really with a role of managing a rackets facility that had 5 padel courts, and with no background before that. Part of my agreement with the facility was that, can you send me to Spain to learn from the best? And 9-10 years ago when I was starting, that's exactly what they did, and I learned from the top coaches in the game. My first ever coaching experience was with Horacio Clemente, who is really the godfather of padel, and I did a coach education course with him, and I spent a lot of time in Madrid and Barcelona and Valencia and traveled to many different parts of Spain to learn more about padel. And I went from really doing full-time tennis to a week later doing full-time padel, and I think in the last 10 years I maybe played tennis once, and it was just a complete switch. It was partly choice, but also partly the facility didn't have tennis courts. So I just had to embrace this new sport, and that's really where it began for me. And now with the Padel School, I'm focusing on trying to help other players, anyone that really picks up a paddle racket, help them in their paddle journey, help them learn more about the game, whether they're a player or a coach, and so that they can have as good an experience as I've had, really.
So you started the Padel School in 2019. Then obviously, a year and a little bit more later, it was COVID, which I felt in Sweden at least gave a real boom to paddle, because it was one of the few sports open and it could be played safely as you are having distance with one another. So did you also see that boom during the pandemic?
It's been interesting. I do a lot of work in different countries for the paddle, so it's quite nice. I get to see how different countries have been developing over these last several years. And Sweden, it seemed that people were not allowed to do certain sports, but they were allowed to play paddle, and the halls were kept open throughout COVID, if I'm not mistaken. And as something similar has happened in some countries, like the UAE, for example, it was under strict lockdown, but then paddle was one of those sports that people were allowed to play. And it's really, I think, thrived in some of those situations, in some of those geographical locations, partly because people went from a period of quarantine and lockdown where they weren't allowed to see anyone. And paddle was such a sociable game that when they came back to playing sport, it was a great one for them to pick up. But then also partly the circumstances of quarantine in different countries meant, it was the best option to keep active and to keep physical.
Yeah. And Ben, you have started a company called Padel 22, and obviously you have also seen like the huge potential for the sport and the interest and the increase of participants and all of this. So why did you decide to start Padel 22, and where do you see the industry going?
Yeah, sure. Well, my paddle journey began in Dubai, but I won't profess to have anything like the background that Sandy does in the sport. I grew up a racket sports player, played a lot of tennis and squash as a junior, and then fast forward, 20 odd years, I was in Dubai where my sister lives, and like a lot of people that seem to get into paddle, was asked at the last minute to fill in a for this kind of curious racket sport that I'd heard a bit about, but not played at all. So I was asked to play paddle, and then I was quickly hooked, and I played a couple more times that week on a trip to Dubai, and then came back to the UK. And this was probably 3 years ago, and there were no courts here really to speak of, and that's changing slowly now. So I've been, in the last 3 years playing increasingly. I think this year, really starting to play a lot more. And then kind of, in tandem with that, I suppose about a year or so ago, I started becoming quite interested in what was going on in the paddle industry, so to speak. So what was going on in the business side of paddle. Very much had a feel outside of the kind of Spanish-speaking world that this was a startup sport, obviously moving at different levels depending on which country you're from. But from the UK model, I saw it kind of, starting to grow. And really took an interest in what was going on from those investing in paddle, those building the courts, which is a big focus at the moment, is on the construction, the planning permission, and all of that side of things. And then increasingly what was going on at the player level. So observing what was happening at the Premier Padel Tour, World Padel Tour. The governance internationally has obviously been a kind of hot topic lately. And really just soaking up what was going on in the sport, meeting as many people as possible. Obviously had a passion for it, playing wise. And I think then probably about the summertime, I was doing a contract with the LTA and really sort of spotted what I thought was an opportunity there's a lot of focus on paddle, perhaps on the court construction, the development, the sites being built in countries like the UK. But from as far as I could see, at least, I didn't see a huge amount of what I'd call kind of really, professional, good communications and storytelling for these burgeoning businesses and individuals getting involved in the sport. And all the trends, again, from the statistics I saw from speaking to people like Sandy was, this is a sport that's on the up and it's here to stay. But I thought, given my background of sports communications, a couple of decades in that world, and kind of a newfound passion and growing knowledge of this sport, I thought actually there's an opportunity to set up essentially a communications consultancy for paddle. Which is a bit of a different model because a lot of sports don't have a specific, communications consultancy for a sport. Often you'll see sports marketing agencies cover or, kind of profess to cover a wide range of sports. But I thought actually with a startup like this, there's an opportunity here because there's not a huge number of people in the industry. So essentially, saw an opportunity there. And I think there's, huge amount happening perhaps in, even more so in 2023 with stories to tell about the clubs, the brands, the players increasingly. the tournament, sponsors, anyone who's got a kind of stake in the sport and wants to tell their story and explain their involvement. I think that's who we're for at Padel 22.
That's very interesting. Because as Sandy mentioned in the beginning also, a lot of players in padel come from tennis. And I guess that a lot of influence, of course it's its own sport, but a lot of influence comes from tennis. But maybe the communication aspect or that profession didn't really follow over as well into padel.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think, through my lens, the communications, PR, marketing, call it what you like, those skills are transferable, even within sport and outside sport. If you're doing political communications, okay, there are specific things working in that sphere, but there's a lot of similarities to being able to communicate good stories within sport or within music or film, whatever the sector. I think the skill set you can take is very transferable. So yeah, sport by sport, absolutely, that's the same case. If someone came to me and said, I want to be part of this consultancy, and they come from a non-racket sport, that's not an issue to me. Obviously, it helps to have a knowledge of the sport, but you can learn that fairly quickly. What's important is the skill set and the background and expertise that person has. So yes, I don't necessarily see that it needs to be people from tennis working in the communications and marketing side of the sport. I think there's knowledge to be had from tennis, but equally a smaller sport like squash and other racket sports. I think there's a lot that you can take, in terms of the knowledge and bring into padel as well. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily going to be that route in terms of people working in the marketing side of padel.
Yeah. You mentioned that now more and more courts are being built and that it's more increasing in the UK. And in Sweden, I felt like during COVID, as I mentioned before, I'm taking Sweden as an example because I know it's best from here. It felt a little bit like the sport was, on steroids, that the amount of players and the venues got a lot increase in the amount of venues, and that wasn't maybe sustainable. So I felt like it rose up too fast, and then now it's declining a little bit to a more healthy level, I think, and the venues and the courts that they build something more. They have a shop, they have a cafeteria, they have some, more things around it. They survive, while this that just, open something to make a quick buck, they have closed down now. So from your perspective, if we start with Sandy maybe, how do you see the development in UK when it comes to the venues? And has it been a similar one to Sweden, or has it been different?
It's interesting, isn't it, the Sweden, the model and what's happened. A few years ago, everyone was saying, oh, I wish the padel was as it is in Sweden. I wish we had that explosive padel growth. And now people are looking at the Swedish padel and really trying to learn from some of the mistakes that have been, have happened along the way due to such a fast growth. And I think it's exactly as you said, that it grew so quickly that people were just putting up buildings with courts in, not caring about their academies, their coaches, their shop, the restaurant, everything like that. And during peak COVID times, they were full and they had a nice court rental from those. And now these clubs, and whenever I go to Sweden, I'm so interested by this because I see those clubs and they're really struggling. And now to differentiate themselves, they need to have a good academy. They need to have a good cafe. And I think one area that I've talked about before on my podcast and in different places is the coach education. And, in Sweden, during the boom, clubs weren't really too concerned about coach education because they thought, right, we're going to just put a coach on court and he's going to be busy anyway, regardless of his experience and his teaching. And now the knowledge of the Swedish padel player is better, and they are expecting better from their coaches, and they can't get that now. So Sweden has a real job on their hands of educating their coaches across the country, which is not going to be easy considering there's probably thousands of people coaching across that country that they need to try and train up. And if we look at the UK side of things, and it's a very different model in my view, because firstly, it's with the LTA, which is the Tennis Federation, which is a very strong government organization in the UK. They have a really structured approach to coach education, as an example, but the same with competition, the same with different areas of the sport. And another thing is that the permissions required to build a club in the UK with government and councils and surveys and everything that is required to build a club is actually very difficult. So it's not going to be a case of, lots of these 10 court facilities or 20, 15 court facilities like you see in Sweden just popping up around the country, because it's actually a lot more difficult than that. And you're seeing now a lot of Swedish investors are not giving up, but they're now taken aback by how complicated that process is. And so I think we'll see slower growth, which actually means that things like the coach education and the competition structure and the people involved in the sport have time to put that infrastructure in place. And so I think it's going to be very different. We also have a different model in that because the federation is supporting it, we're going to see a lot of quote unquote organic growth where tennis clubs put in one or two outdoor paddle courts. And at the moment, we're us in paddle in the UK are thinking, God, that's such a small amount. It's insufficient for a proper tournament. But the accumulation of them around the country, I think, will mean that people have access to a paddle court within their vicinity at some point. It's not the case now because we only have approximately 215 to 220 courts in the whole country. But down the line, I think it will be good for that accessibility.
From like the coaching side, it's so important what you do with the Padel School. And we have, I don't know if you're aware of, I think Andreas Johansson, I think his name is, the coach for Padel in Sweden here, that he has his own YouTube channel. I mean, they have increased so much and people are really looking for information about Padel and techniques and how to do it properly.
Yeah, I'm good friends with Andreas and a big fan of his work. And I'm regularly communicating with him about how he's doing with his training and how he's doing with the guys on tour. I know he's with Danny Vindal and Simon Vasquez and those guys traveling on World Padel Tour. So I've done a few podcast episodes with him, and I thoroughly enjoy my conversations with him. And he's also aware of, you know, that the mountain that needs to be climbed when it comes to coach education in Sweden.
Yeah. And Ben, when we were talking about now the paddle and the interest for paddle and maybe the growth in UK, when you are talking to people in the paddle and around the different racket sports, is there a fear from other racket sports like squash and tennis that this might cannibalize on their sport, or are they positive to that this is something new and exciting?
Yes and no. I think if you take tennis, my observations are that there perhaps initially was, you know, it was seen to be a bit of a threat when people saw the, you know, certainly the upward graph showing paddle's participation rates and interest and everything from kind of, you know, views and hits and audiences online, all of these statistics showing it's moving in that direction. Whereas, of course, a lot of traditional sports, not just tennis, but a lot of traditional sports, the graph is going in the wrong direction. And that's not necessarily just paddle's contribution. That's a state of kind of younger generations getting into sport, perhaps previous generations where they're maybe focused more on esports or gaming, or so sport itself has a battle to win the new generations. But yeah, certainly kind of the general feeling I had from speaking to people was, yes, perhaps this is seen as a threat. We might not necessarily admit that, but we do see, you know, there's a worry about what happens to other racket sports. But I'm also seeing kind of increasingly people talk of it, you know, in a kind of complementary way. So these sports can help each other. It doesn't need to be an either or. The transition from one to the other, we hear a lot about tennis players going to paddle, but it can work both ways. And similarly, don't forget squash. Okay, it's not such a mainstream sport. It's big in Middle East, Britain, certain countries, although it's declined in recent years. But there's, you know, obviously, and Sandy will speak about this a lot more, but there's huge skills in the squash side of things to take to paddle as well. So yes, to a certain extent, it could be seen as a threat, but I think actually they need to coexist and find a way of, you know, working to everyone's benefit. And I think it doesn't need to be to the detriment of one traditional racket sport that paddle surges forward. So I think it's an open market, but it's an opportunity for all of them to find their place.
And I feel like paddle has also taken over a little bit. Like it's the new golf, if you understand me correctly, that it's something that like for companies, you can do it as like with the office, but it's so accessible for everyone in different ages, which maybe is not the same for tennis, I would say.
Yeah, we hear a lot about how inclusive it is. And I think, yeah, again, my experience is it is much quicker perhaps to get on court and participate at a half decent level than something like tennis is, which can be seen as quite intimidating when you're playing other players on court. And there's always that worry as a tennis player, I find, that, you know, a slight embarrassment. Are they going to be the right standard if I have a hit with them, or is this going to be a wasted hour for both of us? I don't feel with paddle that's quite as jarring, that difference in levels. So I think, it is more inclusive. It's also kind of on the court, it feels more intimate. There's perhaps more kind of, camaraderie and banter and just more kind of relationship building within the time you have on the paddle court. So I think those are some trump cards that the sport has that others like tennis don't.
Yeah, and I mean, I would echo Ben's thoughts there, really, in that, when you compare it to golf, you go around in a foursome and you usually have a fun round, lots of kind of banter, between holes and a drink at the end. And I think that kind of mentality has been taken up by paddle. I think the difference is golf is a very technical sport. You've got to have played for quite a while and probably had lessons in order to really enjoy a round of golf, in my opinion. And I would say the same for tennis. And the beauty of paddle is that you don't necessarily need that. You can get started straight away. And I think that technical barrier to entry is what gets a lot of people into it in the first place. And I think part of the reason that I enjoyed it so much is that even as a good tennis player, you could come to paddle and you could learn a lot about the game. And the better you get, the more tactically and physically challenging paddle is. I don't feel it's like a sport that it's just easy to play to begin with and you can have a very good beginner game, but it gets boring later on. It's one of those sports where now, even for my level, playing world championships, things like that, I'm constantly learning or having to adapt my techniques and physicality depending on the opponents that I play. And I think that challenge keeps it exciting for both beginners and also more experienced players.
Definitely. It's we actually, me and my friends were filming some of our games, and you think in your head that you're pretty good, and then you watch it and you think like, okay, and then you watch World Padel Tour, for example, and then it's like, okay, there are levels to this as well. So I hear you, but I think that's the beauty of it, that you can enjoy it on all the different levels and that you have something to strive for always. It's
a real eye-opener when you film your own games. That's when we do our online working with players, or when they send videos in to receive feedback, that's always the shock to the player, is having seen themselves play. And it can be very good for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in my opinion, in order to grow a sport sustainably, it's very important with the grassroots level. So to start, how do you get kids involved and grow the game from the bottom up? So that is something that in Sweden that they are trying to become a part of the National Federation of Sports, and to get funding and in order to get kids into the game and grow it from there. So how does it look in UK with for clubs to have for kids and so forth?
I mean, firstly, I would say we mentioned Andreas earlier, and I think he's done a great job he's in Helsingborg, in the area there with the junior academies, and it takes someone with that drive and motivation to even put on those academies. And it's not an easy situation again in Sweden, because your federation is, let's just say it probably needs a bit of work. There needs to be a bit of a synchronization with your federation and all of the private invested companies around the country. And so again, I think this will tie in very closely to your coach education in Sweden, where once the coaches are up to speed and they've been trained, part of that training should be managing larger groups and managing juniors and how to run successful sessions in the various age groups. And I think, again, this is a situation where right now, if we look at the UK now, it's probably difficult for juniors to receive good coaching and good training and access to more juniors and juniors competitions. But again, we've only got 220 courts, and so it will take time. But I think when that time arrives, we will be in a better position for it. I was involved in the writing of the coach education for the paddle, and a section of that is in juniors, and we have another elective on junior training and how to start with kids and how to organize those sessions. So even though right now it's probably at its start, I think we will be in a good position when the time comes.
And from a professional level, for these kids to have role models? I know in, again, Sweden, trying to break into the top 100. I think you named Daniel Windahl. I think he has just broken into the top 100 on the World Padel Tour rankings. So how are the British players doing? And is there a focus to, do something similar to break into the top 100?
Yes, and I have to say, full respect to Danny, because really he has trained incredibly hard, and people don't realize the time and the effort that he has put in to get to that level. People are just seeing his results and thinking he's playing just a few of the Swedish Padel Tour and a few of the World Padel Tour, and he's got to that level. But he, having had these conversations with Andreas in their off season, Danny has really put the time in and the training in, and they need to do that. I'm saying they as in countries like the UK and Sweden and wherever they're developing. They need to do that in order to catch up the counterparts in Spain and Argentina, because those players have been part of academies since they were young. And so, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of work that has to go into that. And initially, the Swedish players were traveling to Spain for that training, and really it was the only place that they could get that level of training, that the competition, that the players to play against. And now there's more of that training that takes place in Sweden, which I think is fantastic. And I think countries will end up following that similar model. I mean, of our British team, the majority of our team are based in Spain because they will get better paddle in Spain, and that's where they can do their training. They will get more competitive tournaments. And I'm hoping that in however many years' time, we will be able to train in the UK to a high level, a bit like you can now in Sweden, but it takes time and courts and support. So yeah, we're not there yet, but hopefully one day we will be.
I hope so. And from a communication marketing standpoint, in order to, raise these questions that Sandy mentioned and to help grow the sport, what do you think are some tasks to be done?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from the player perspective, there's actually, a lot of good work's been done by the players, perhaps by accident in a way, because essentially padel hasn't had the mainstream press attention or the media attention outside of, again, its heartlands, it's kind of Latin America, Spanish heartlands. So there haven't been the journalists approaching necessarily the players from the mainstream saying, okay, we want to write and expose this sport. So the players have done a lot of good work themselves through, I guess what we'd call kind of social media or influencer marketing type techniques, etc. So raising their own brands and gaining their own audiences that way, because, and again, probably the more shrewd amongst them will see that's going to help have a knock-on effect with getting sponsors and becoming kind of commercially attractive. So I think the players have done a lot of work that other sports haven't done because they've had their kind of PR advisors to help them, and they've been a little bit more spoon-fed. So that's a good grounding, I'd say, from the players' perspective. I think there's a lot to do, and this, comes back to the kind of rationale for setting up something like Padel 22. There's a lot to do, I think, on the the brand and sponsor perspective. So there's a lot, increasing number of brands who want to pin their kind of colours to the paddle mast, if you like, to ride the sort of the popularity wave. But again, it's always that difficult thing. How do you communicate why a brand is getting involved in this sport? They might have similar demographics to reach from a kind of commercial perspective, but they need to tell those stories as to why they're getting involved in paddle to kind of bring that story to life. And then, likewise, the tournaments, similarly, why are they pitching to be a host city of a certain tournament? What's that doing for their local population? These are all kind of stories, I guess, to be told, because it's going to benefit them. It's going to raise their profile. It's going to help their own commercial interests, which is ultimately why they're probably doing this. And I think there's a lot of, the industry, I guess, the sport needs to professionalize from the kind of communications and marketing perspective. And that would be the same with any sort of quote unquote startup sport. And I think, that's certainly not entirely down to Padel 22 to do that. But if we can, in our small way, help contribute to, some good communications, good marketing, good influencer marketing, all these different strategies you use to tell these stories, then that's, our motivation is really to help grow the sport in the way that we can, raise its profile and essentially sort of take it mainstream in these new territories.
Yeah, and one issue in that I have noticed that I also spoke to Hernan August about over a year ago, then when he was at the World Padel Tour, is that a lot of the communication that goes out specifically from them are in Spanish, and that it's so focused on Spain and Spanish-speaking countries. So maybe one way also to help growing the sport from a communication aspect is to get more content out in English or in more languages.
Yeah, Sandy, I'm sure it's a perfect case study with the Padel School, but yeah, absolutely. You know, I speak a basic level of Spanish, but I don't profess to be focusing on the communication and marketing in that market. I'm aware there are other companies that have had a years long head start in doing that. So very much I see this as not a UK focused company, yes, a UK based, but actually this is to really grow the sport in these emerging territories. Everything from a country right at the start of its paddle journey, such as Australia, I would suggest, to those that are a bit further along that do have English as not necessarily as a first language, but a dominant kind of business language. So there's huge opportunities in, again, the non-Spanish speaking world to communicate in English, to get the message out to an international audience who do communicate in English primarily. And that's really where I see the opportunity for something like this.
I think also on that note, the FIP and the World Padel Tour, I mean, they've only given English as a language very recently. I remember going to a European and World Championships, 2 years ago, and the opening ceremony would be in Spanish. And there, of all of the nations, there's 3, or 4 Spanish-speaking nations, and all of the rest are English is essentially the common language. And I think it's starting to change now. We recently, the last year or two, we've seen English commentary now for semifinals and finals, and but still there's a lot in Spanish. So, I mean, this is exactly why I started the Padel School, was to get this information in English out there and to help people find out more about the game and to understand more about it. And that was mainly because when I was starting, there was not a single piece of English content. I mean, not like I couldn't find literally a single video or single blog in English on paddle, 8 or 9 years ago.
And I mean, that must be just so important, as you said, with the Padel School, that you can get this information out, and someone from yourself that has played and coached on a high level, and just to get that out for free on YouTube and, spreading the knowledge to so many people that obviously was looking for it.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people are talking about putting information out there, and a lot of people are doing, tutorials in English, which I think is fantastic. And I spent probably 6 years of going to Spain back and forward, learning coach education, learning to play the game. I'd already been competing for Great Britain for 3 or 4 years before I even put my first video out there. So, I mean, for me, I didn't feel confident enough to give that advice unless I was able to do it myself and understood it fully. So, and I think that now we try and produce as much content as we can. And I saw your recent podcast with Danny Glover, I think, from Vayner Sport, and Gary Vee is an example of someone who puts out a phenomenal amount of content. And so we're trying at the Padel School to put out that information really from anyone from a beginner level wants to know the rules or starting the game, right up to someone that is competing in competition.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really important as well. Looking back over, if we start with Sandy, over your career, has there been any bumps on the road? And if so, how have you overcome them?
I think I've probably had two. Well, if I took a look at a bump on the road, physically, and when I was learning and training, after I'd been training for about 3 years and I'd been going back and forth, I tore my ACL in my knee, and I've actually ended up having a couple of surgeries on that. And I think that was a time that I was really obviously frustrated with that. I was competing well. I was playing in the World Padel Tour previous and enjoying traveling and competing. And in some ways, that was almost what was the catalyst for me starting the Padel School. Really, was that the time I had off, which was altogether probably about 12 months, and the idea of being at home and thinking, how can I still improve in the game and trying to access content, which was difficult. My Spanish improved, but I wasn't getting much content in English, and that's really when I put my thoughts together and said, right, let's start producing this content. And I just had to do what every athlete does when they've been injured like that, be rigid with the rehabilitation, spend my time focusing on what I can do well now that I'm not as mobile as I used to be. And just really that helped me dissect the game, because padel is so tactical, and if you know where to place the ball and how to play the points, then you actually don't need to be physically running around like a headless chicken. And so that was, I would say, one bump. And from a Padel School perspective, or a business perspective, I suppose, another bump for me, and it's not so much a bump, but it's been an adaptation, is really making this move from Dubai back to the UK. I was there as the Crown Prince's paddle coach and manager of his racket sports facility, in a very, very secure job in a country where you don't pay tax. And I was able, I had a stadium court I could produce all of my videos on, and I had time to do it. And it was, I went from that atmosphere and setup to coming back to the UK with a 1-year-old and not having access to indoor facilities or places that I could do the filming. And so I've had to be creative, and I've had to learn the hard way about setting up the business effectively and making sure that all those systems are in place. And it was, that jump for me was a bit of a scary jump, in a way that, I was obviously very comfortable in Dubai, but really felt like the kind of entrepreneurial side of me and the Padel School, I wanted to take that leap and wanted to make it work. So those are my kind of two areas, I would say.
The move was because of the Padel School, or because you said you had a 1-year-old. Was it a family decision, or?
It was a bit of both. I worked at still probably the most amazing sports facility in the world, at least one of them, NAS Sports Complex. And I was the rackets manager there for about 8.5 years. And I helped work with the federation, the UAE Padel Association, and set that up. And I just felt like there was more I could do in the world of padel, and I was working a little bit with the British Federation and the LTA to set up their coach education courses. And so I really felt like London would be a good place. I could see the upward curve starting in the UK, and I thought I wanted to be here in the UK before that happens. And so it was partly a tactical padel decision, and partly having a child really changed everything from sleep to work and personal life, and so to come back with family again was a big part of that as well.
I understand that. And for Ben?
Yeah, so similarities, actually, the two, there's been plenty of bumps on the road, to be honest, but I think the main ones that spring to light are when I've spent time working abroad, and on 2 occasions, repatriated, I guess, to the UK for different reasons. I think the first one, I lived in Dubai for much less time than Sandy, but a couple of years of my life, 12 years ago now, and I went from London, where I was kind of very junior, trying to make my mark, I guess, in a competitive industry, to going to Dubai, where you are in a lot of industries given opportunities much quicker than you might in a more mature market like the UK. And that was a fantastic learning curve, where I was essentially put in charge of communications for the Dubai Tennis Championships at the age of 24, 25, much earlier than would have been the case in a more mature market. But it was a steep learning curve and a great kind of step in my career. And taking those learnings, I think, from, again, a very comfortable existence, a very, fantastic place to be working in sport, in a fairly early stage sports market as it was then, to coming back to the UK for reasons that essentially I wanted to carry that experience and come back to a more competitive market and test myself, amongst a much more flooded market, I guess, in terms of the number of sports marketing agencies, people trying to kind of vie for their place and trying to make things work. So that was bumpy moving back, taking the plunge from I could have stayed there to actually trying to take that experience and learn again in the UK. But in hindsight, yes, it was the right thing to do. And that, similarly, I think fast forward probably 7 years, I'd spent 4 years in Montreal working for the World Anti-Doping Agency. It was a really high profile role, a great 4 years for many reasons. And then, I'd set up a home there and had family and thought the time's right to move back to the UK again to take that experience. Yes, for personal reasons, to be closer to kind of friends and family, but also to, again, try and enter a kind of more mature market. The UK, it's very advanced, I'd say, compared to a lot of countries in terms of sports marketing, and take those learnings I have from 4 years and, build that in the UK. And again, tough learnings, not easy to move back once you've had a life overseas, to reintegrate with your kind of home culture, as it were, and learn the business again. So those were tricky times. And I think a very recent one is essentially coming from being a consultant to a pretty new sport that I've been learning at I feel like pretty quick rate, but learning that this sport is different to others. So being as you're setting up a company in a sport like padel, being humble and soaking as much as you can from people like Sandy who've got years of experience in the industry, learning what works, learning the landscape. There's many governance issues. There's a lot of private sector involvement coupled with the kind of the government side, government federations, etc. So it's a real minefield of a landscape to navigate, particularly as everyone's finding their feet. So that's been a learning, sure, the last 6 months, but it's never supposed to be easy. So I always take it on as a challenge and see it as a positive, not a negative.
Yeah, and it is an exciting industry, and I believe that it's one to invest in for sure. And it's interesting that both of you have similar stories when it comes to Dubai. But approaching the end here, is there something I haven't mentioned yet that you feel is important to bring up?
Just briefly from my side, I think what interests me, and I'm sure I think it's similar to having spoken to Sandy about it, is there's a lot of, when you're in the UK, it's a bubble as well. A lot of people focus on padel in the UK, but actually, UK is only at one stage of its padel journey, as every country is. And what interests me is kind of the predictions and the foresight of what's coming down the line with other countries, the way it's not being talked about. I think Australia is a good example. I know some of the people there involved with advancing the sport, and they have the Australian Open Padel taking place in January, first of its kind. That's obviously a sports loving market, so that will be a really interesting case study for how quickly they advance the sport there. Then of course there's always the question of the States and North America, and how a sport or any product breaks into that market successfully. Of course, the talk at the moment there is very much on pickleball, but it's what will happen once the US market is exposed to padel. My very basic guess is that sport will appeal in many more ways than pickleball does, because of the complexities and the kind of fascination with it. So there's different aspects globally, I think, to watch out for with padel's progress.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We've talked predominantly about Sweden and the UK, and I think there's everything in between. We've talked about the Sweden really has adopted that almost private investment model of building lots of big clubs, and we've seen how that's going, and we've seen in a way similar in the UAE that they've up to almost 500 courts, and it's gone through this boom, and maybe also they could have learned a little bit more from the Swedish growth in the last few years, and it will be so interesting to see what happens with Australia, the US, Germany. All of these countries are at the beginning stages, like the UK, and I think it's not one size fits all with how the sport develops. I think there's going to be a combination of public tennis clubs developing the game, but also private investment to have these facilities. And I really, really hope that the countries find what works for them, and there aren't too many of these monster companies that are trying to buy clubs all over the world, but then not necessarily run them that efficiently. And I don't think that does necessarily any favors for the sport. So I'm kind of, I'm rooting for the sport here. I hope that it develops well in each of those countries respective to their local population and demographic.
Yeah, me too, for sure. The last question that I ask everyone, we can start with Sandy, is that if you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who do you think that I should talk to?
Well, as you've done a two-person one here, Marcus, I think it would be great if you could get someone from the World Padel Tour and you could get someone from Premier Padel into the same room and have a discussion around where the professional circuit is going. And while you're at it, you could also get a third person from the APT, because I feel like this is a really interesting area that, it just shows that the sport of padel is so young in that the approach that we're seeing at this top level of professionalism, the top however many players in the world are involved in all of these different tours. It would be, that would be my recommendation, Marcus. If you could get them on, then that's definitely going to get downloaded by me.
Yeah, we should have a panel discussion. That would be very interesting if we could make that happen.
I'm going to give, we haven't been comparing notes, but I actually have someone from Premier Padel as well for different reasons. Someone I know there who works for BN Media Group, a guy called David Sugden, who's the legal counsel and chief communications officer. And I think interesting company, not just for padel, but actually what they've been doing in terms of Qatar sports investments with sport generally. Obviously, there's a big focus on the Middle East at the moment with Qatar World Cup and a lot of scrutiny on the country. But I think that's an interesting model for what they do in terms of, buying football clubs, similar to that Manchester City model, taking on new sports like padel, and investing generally in obviously that region, but internationally, and putting the Middle East's footprint, I guess, on the sports map. So I think that would be an interesting company and certainly an interesting person to speak to.
Definitely, and a hot topic also right now with, as you said, with Manchester United and also with World Cup and all of that part of the world taking a bigger footprint on the sports in general.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a lot to kind of discuss in terms of what that part of the world does with sport, and I think without getting into the politics of it, it's in some ways deserves a fair hearing. A country like Qatar with how it's investing in sport and what it's trying to do. These things are always nuanced and always have good intentions as well as the difficulties. So it's certainly an interesting topic.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think just quickly on that with the countries in the GCC in the Middle East, I think they're really trying to do a great effort for padel. The involvement with the Premier Padel, UAE have just hosted the World Championships, and the intentions are definitely there. I know the group in Qatar, and they are have really promoted the game. They've recently done a celebrity footballers tournament, as part of the World Championships there in Qatar, and yes, there are probably some discussions around what goes on behind the scenes, but I don't think you can knock their drive and their enthusiasm to grow the game. And I think that we need them as much as we need all of the countries to help push this sport forward.
So with that said, Sandy and Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you very much for having us, Marcus. An absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.